recording this, so hopefully you can excuse that I'm super annoying. Anyway, I think most followers of American politics at this point would agree America is in a kind of political crisis today. It's a difficult thing to quantify, but, look at it. I think one under-discussed dimension of this is our political system itself. The US Constitution is treated as a document of almost religious importance, and it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, democratic constitutions in the world, and it's very historic and important. But how democratic is it really? Of the seven presidential elections since the year 2000, two were won by the runner-up in number of votes, and of House elections in that same period, one was lost by the party that won 1 million more votes. And of course, the Senate and Supreme Court also receive controversy for their undemocratic natures. So, what does this unrepresentativeness have to do with the Constitution? Well, the U.S. Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787, 4 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. As you probably already know, it was replacing the 1777 Articles of Confederation, which were the first document to unite the former 13 colonies as one independent state to fight the British. But was the US really one country under the Articles? It really wasn't. The only branch of central government they established was Congress, which was actually less of an elected legislative body at the time, and just gave each state exactly one vote on matters. And as the usual historiography of it goes, the national government lacked the authority to deal with the post-Civil War monetary crisis, post-Revolutionary War. It lacked a mechanism to enforce its acts, and was threatened by the 1786 Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, which was against taxes, which of course were necessary to pay off the nation's immense debts after the Revolutionary War. So in 1786, the Annapolis Convention, which was called by states to negotiate over interstate trade barriers, was called, which would lead to a broader debate on the structure of the nation, which became the Constitutional Convention. So let's talk about that. The Philadelphia Constitutional Convention was a meeting of representatives from all 13 states. And quickly, the convention became divided between those who favored a stronger central government and those who wanted something more centralized. The delegates from smaller states, like Delaware, advocated for giving them more representation as opposed to the larger states. And that's a big part of why we have institutions today that favor states rather than being proportional by population because of this divide. James Madison, often known as the father of the Constitution, favored a tricameral federal government, which would be one with separate and co-equal executive, legislative, and judicial branches, rather than the system of the Articles of Confederation, which just had the Congress. The Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu, who you remember from high school world history, devised the idea of separation of powers into these three branches. Now, there were different plans for how the government should be structured. The Virginia plan, which was the one penned by James Madison, also favored having two houses of Congress, of which one would be directly elected and one would be chosen by state legislatures, so the House and the Senate. And you should be familiar with this because it was the model that would be used until the 1913 17th Amendment made senators directly elected. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention were able to agree on the idea of this separation of powers, but the representatives of smaller states wanted a legislature where each state had one vote. And eventually the compromise was reached where the Senate would operate on that model, because as you know, each state has two senators, and the House would be directly elected. So in 1788, each state agrees to ratify this. Also, I couldn't fit this anywhere else in the script, but did you know the Constitution has a provision to allow for calling another Constitutional Convention? It's never happened, though. Interesting. Well, actually, it isn't that living of a document, but it's been amended 27 times. The first 10 gave us the rights to speech, a well-regulated militia, no quartering soldiers in your house, protection from search, due process, trial by jury, civil lawsuits, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, freedom to unenumerated rights, and the delegation of non-enumerated powers to the states in that order. The other important ones were the 12th Amendment, which established the President and VP being elected separately. We'll go over that later. 13 to 15 ended slavery and fixed racism forever, and racism was never a problem again. 17 provided for senators being directly elected, and 19 let women vote. And obviously the other ones were important, but those were the most fundamental to the evolution of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, the most well-known set of amendments, which were promised by the Federalists, who were those who favored the Constitution, to those more skeptical during the Constitutional Convention. Even though Alexander Hamilton, probably the most well known Federalist, in his Federalist Papers, which advocated for the Constitution, opposed the Bill of Rights. The 12th Amendment is actually probably under discussed for how important it was. In the first four presidential elections, the runner up became VP. Could you imagine if we had that today? Which meant that for the first two uncontested elections, well, basically uncontested, so each presidential elector cast one of their votes for George Washington, but then for their other vote, they would vote for whoever they wanted to be VP. And this, in the next two elections, which were actually competitive, unlike the first two, led to an insane amount of plotting and scheming to vote for this guy this many times, and I'll vote once for this guy. And generally, it was a problem, which is why 18, which is why they got rid of that. Now, 1820 was the third and last, basically uncontested presidential election after the ones of Washington. In fact, one elector actually voted for, I believe, former President John Adams, solely to make sure that George Washington would be the only person to ever get every presidential vote. But 1824 was another entirely singular event, 4 years after having the third most unanimous election ever. Now, do you want to know what happens when no one wins majority in the Electoral College? Well, this is by far the ugliest wiki box for any presidential election. I have no idea why they don't put all four side by side instead of doing two rows, which makes it impossible to see it all at once. So, let's scroll down. So you might ask, what is that? Then you would see, oh, I see. So the House votes on the president. So if no one wins a majority in the Electoral College, then the House picks the winner. No big deal. It's so streamlined and efficient. I mean, compared to institutions we have like the Electoral College, it almost seems like a reasonable solution to what you would do if there was a tie. I mean, that's what I would think of. Congress picks it if there's a tie. The individual representatives don't vote, silly. Each state's House delegation casts one vote. So to win, you need a majority and a majority of each state's delegation to the House. I'm pretty sure there's no other thing anywhere in government where each state House delegation votes as a block like this. And it's for this reason that something insane happens when no one wins a majority of state electoral votes. As whereas the House is first past the post nature, the same problem in the Senate and every state legislature, that the U.S. has always had a two-party system for most intents and purposes. First, the Democratic Republicans against the Federalists, who collapsed, and then the Republicans, as the Democratic Republicans were known at the time, splintering into the party's Jacksonian faction, which became the modern Democratic Party, and the pro-John Quincy Adams faction becoming the Adams-Clay Republicans, then known as the Whigs. Who became the Whigs, who would split in half over slavery, birthing the modern Republican Party as an anti-slavery movement. And no non-Democratic or Republican has won or even came close to winning a presidential election since 1848. Also, as a brief aside, this is somehow the first time I've mentioned either political party in this video. I want to mention something I've noticed looking at other countries' political systems. There's basically nowhere else where political parties work like they do here, and you might ask, what do I mean by that? Well, in most countries with parliamentary systems, as common in, say, Europe, political parties are usually dues-paying organizations which can expel members and have a central leadership that gets to pick and choose candidates. Now, here in the US, we pride ourselves on our primary elections rather than, candidates being chosen in smoke-filled rooms, as happened before the 1920s progressive era, when the first primaries were invented. And this largely continued until certain fun events happened in 1968's Democratic National Convention. Now, what this means is that being a member of a party in the US is something you tick off when you apply to vote. Now, in most states, you can only vote in the primary elections of the party you're a member of. And given the fact that third-party and independent candidates literally never win, except when they do, this is kind of like a de facto two-round system, right? Except one sorted by ideology, where the half of the country that considers themselves left of center votes for their candidate, and the half that considers themselves right of center vote for their candidate. And this creates what's called a center squeeze effect, where oftentimes whatever candidate is favored by the majority doesn't make it to the second round because they wouldn't be the majority of people's first choice, but the majority of people's second choice. This is often complained about in actual two-round systems, which I would argue the U.S.'s primary system kind of creates something similar to, such as in France, where in their 2007 presidential election, the the centrist liberal Francis Bayrou, I definitely just said that wrong, who enjoyed apparently majority support of the population, narrowly missed the second round of the election because only the top two candidates, kind of like what we do, sort of, kind of, not really, was a two-way contest between socialist Ségolène Royal, I said that wrong, and center-right Nicolas Sarkozy, I said that wrong, who is currently in jail for taking money from Gaddafi after winning the election, or in Alaska's 2002 Senate race, which, unlike most U.S. elections, actually used a two-round system, and in which the more centrist and popular candidate was did make it to the second round. Now you might ask what's wrong with political parties not being ruled by a small number of elites, after all, isn't the whole point of this video that I'm supposed to like democracy. But also, I would argue that having political parties that are more cohesive ideologically would probably be a better thing than having half of the country in one and half of the country in another. But for an actual multi-party system work, you would need to scrap the Electoral College and probably the House and probably the Senate. Moving on. Well, I just talked a lot about the Constitution, but is it really that bad? Keep in mind that my arguments here are basically based on the premise that we all can agree we want the most democratic possible system, but also one reasonably stable. So let's start with the first, well, not really first, but the first one I'm going to talk about, branch, Congress. The U.S. House, like, for example, British Parliament, and many other legislatures, is elected based on a series of roughly equally sized districts, with each being around 700,000 currently. With there being 435 total. Some are extra big because some states are too big, and they get redistricted once per sentence, and sometimes more as right now. As of when I'm writing this, California, Texas, Virginia, Missouri, and I think Florida and some other states, are deliberately gerrymandering district boundaries to harm the party that doesn't currently control the state legislature. To use the world's most tired quote, it's the politicians picking the voters and not the other way around. If one party were to win 49% of the vote in every district in the whole country, they would win 0 seats. And obviously that's a silly example. But as recently as 2010, the party that won a majority of votes didn't win a majority of seats in the House. So that's interesting. Anyway, and the other house of Congress is the Senate. The way the Senate works is that 2/3 of seats, I think it's a third. Why did I write 2/3? Are elected every 2 years, depending on which states are up for election that year. Now, that means that if 70% of people voting that year voted for one party, they might not flip the Senate, because only 2/3 of states vote at a time. And more importantly than that, each state, regardless of size, gets 2 seats. Now, by some miracle, the Senate is usually roughly tied, because the Democrats have tiny fake states, like Delaware, Connecticut, and Maine, and the Republicans have tiny fake states like Wyoming, Idaho, and North Dakota. This is objectively and grotesquely bad and evil, and I would not accept any argument that values a Wyoming 50 times more than a Californian, because they're wrong. Now for the second branch of government. I mean, they don't all have numbers, but I'm just going to talk about the court. Anyway, this is the most controversial thing I'll say all video. The Supreme Court isn't that bad or undemocratic, unlike what some people say. Every recent controversial ruling happened because the Supreme Court is forced to act as a third house of Congress, because they're incapable of passing anything due to the filibuster and stuff. Okay, well, when I wrote this, the Voting Rights Act redistricting ruling hadn't happened yet. I was more so talking about, like, Roe v. Wade and how that was never codified, but I think the Voting Rights Act thing is kind of a more egregious example of the Supreme Court being bad. And I haven't mentioned the filibuster. That's another big reason why our politics don't work at all, because in a world where you win 59 seats in the Senate, the presidency, and a majority in the House, you still can't pass anything, which is exactly what happened to Obama. Anyway, the Electoral College, which chooses the president. In the Electoral College, you need a majority of electoral votes, which are magic numbers proportional to each state's population, plus 2 as a bonus. This means small states get overweighted, and more importantly, winning any plurality, however small, of a state gets you 100% of its votes. This means that the non-winner has won in 5 different presidential elections, 2 of them in the last 30 years. Like the Senate, this is wrong, and I would say weighting smaller states is bad, and the winner-take-all plurality thing is bad and unfair, and also makes elections way more fun to watch. Now, whenever you're defending the Electoral College, you have to remember the Founding Fathers didn't imagine the system as each state should hold their own election, and then they give 100% of their electoral votes to that candidate. And of course, Wyoming should get 50 times more votes than California. Well, for one, Wyoming and California were both Spanish at the time. But the Electoral College was originally a meeting of representatives chosen by every state legislature, a sort of assembly of wise men to choose the president. But over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, states adopted choosing their electors via popular vote, first electing individual electors, and then slates of electors via winner-take-all of the whole state. The Electoral College is still, if they don't actually ever do that, free to choose whoever they want. In 2016, a number of electors for both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the two most loved people in the whole country, both parties went from choosing mostly random party apparatchiks as electors, because a lot of them decided to defect in the Electoral College vote, to like state governors and members of Congress. As you can see, Illinois' electors in 2016 were mostly current or former members of the state house, while in 2020 most were more important things, you know. This pattern exists in most other states and was probably done because having more prominent electors means if they choose to vote with their conscience instead of for the party nominee, they would face more backlash. Also, in 2004, one Democratic elector voted for John Edwards, spelled that way, who was the VP nominee for that year. Well, Edwards, not Edwards. And we'll never know which Minnesota elector did that because they were anonymous. And they were a hero. Now, somehow I've spent this whole video talking about the three branches of the federal government, which obviously have their own problems, but states work is that each state is treated as kind of sovereign in its own right, although less since, say, the Civil War. But each state's territory can only be changed with the consent of its legislature, unlike more unitary countries, and the sovereignty of individual states, obviously, can be beneficial when, I don't know, say, the national government supports slavery. I think another unappreciated bad thing, though, is on the local government level. Most U.S. cities, obviously, face a lot of criticism for, like, suburban sprawl and stuff. But another thing is that they tend to be parceled out into very small municipalities with no organs that coordinate their activities over regions. Like, look at the Bay Area. There are 100 different cities in the Bay Area. Yeah. So, take one. Obviously, the U.S. Constitution was revolutionary in its time, but a lot of the governing structures established by the U.S. Constitution are very imperfect. The Constitution can be amended, of course, but as I mentioned earlier, there's also a mechanism to call another constitutional convention, which has never happened, ever. Now, if you've ever thought about reforming the Constitution, you would probably want to look at other examples, like, other Western democracies, such as legally and culturally, the U.S. takes the most after the country we split from in 1776, or 75. I'm obviously not an expert in the politics of the UK, just like I'm not of the politics here, but like with the US, we can probably learn some things from how the government works. The preeminent body that passes legislation there is the Parliament's House of Commons, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, legislative bodies in the world. Laws formally have to be passed by the House of Lords, too, but the Commons gave themselves the power to override that in 1911, which is a good thing because the House of Lords, as its name would imply, is made up of mostly unelected aristocrats, peers appointed by the Prime Minister, the bishops of the Church of England, and other fun things. Very fun and quirky, kind of like the fact they have a king in 2026. But real power rests the House of Commons. And the other thing I think is kind of interesting is the UK has no single written constitutional document. So the House of Commons can pass anything they want that overrides any other previous law, which is interesting. So obviously the House of Commons is very important. So how are they elected? Well, let's look at the UK's last election in 2024. July 4th, 2024, I believe. Keir Starmer's Labour Party won 34% of the vote and 63% of the seats. The Tories, led by then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, won 23% of the vote and 18% of the seats. And Reform UK, led by everyone's favorite Nigel Farage, won 3rd place in votes, but 7th place in seats with just 5 members of parliament. What you'll notice is that by looking at the number of seats, or at this map, you'd assume Labour won some enormous supermajority, when in fact, they really didn't. This is because, like the US House, the UK's House of Commons is elected by first past the post in 650 different districts. You need to win a plurality of most of these districts for a majority, not a majority of the national popular vote. With the UK's multi party system breaking down, something that I was just talking about wanting to happen here, but what that means is that because the traditionally dominant Labour and Conservative parties won just 58% of the vote, compare that to like 98% here, means the system that's mostly fine ish for a two party system breaks down when a much more multi party system emerges. So, whenever anyone, like me, talks about a multi party system in the US, they have to remember that with our current political institutions, this would happen, which is bad. So, how do you solve that? Well, I guess it would be by electing the whole or part of the parliament via proportional representation, where seats are allocated according to percent of the national vote. So, how does that go? Does anyone do that? Germany's Bundestag, which is their lower house of parliament, operates on a mixed member proportional representation system. This means that some of the seats are elected via a series of districts, and some allocated via state level party lists. There's also a threshold to win 5% of the seats to enter parliament, which means several significant parties in the last election, like the Free Democratic Party and the Bundesratsvereinigung, both of which previously held seats, failed to win any in 2025. Now, why might they have such a rule? The first republic in Germany was, like the monarchy before it, officially known simply as the Deutsches Reich, but became known by its supporters as the German Republic and by its detractors as the Weimar Republic, because the first meeting of its elected National Assembly was held in the small town of Weimar, with Berlin caught in revolutionary violence at the time. From the beginning, the Republic was raked by instability, with Germany's longtime largest political party, the SPD, having been split into two by supporting or opposing World War I. The anti-war Independent SPD or USPD and the majority or MSPD would remerge in 1920, but not before members of the USPD, including Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, founded the Communist Party of Germany, elements of which would rise up against the new Republican government in the 1919 Spartacist uprising, just months after the Kaiser abdicated and fled the country. The MSPD-led government, under President Friedrich Ebert, cooperated with proto-fascist paramilitaries, the Freikorps, to put down their revolt. These events would permanently fracture the left for the duration of the Weimar Republic. Some years later, the Republic had relatively stabilized, with power rotating between the reformist but officially Marxist SPD and the coalition, while the right liberal DVP and the proto-fascist DNVP would also occasionally enter government with the center. In 1924, World War I General Paul von Hindenburg, supported by forces as diverse as the DVP, the NVP, and the early Nazi Party, won the presidency. Now, unlike what his supporters wanted, he did not immediately dismantle the Republic. But after the 1928 formation of a grand coalition of the SPD, DDP, Center, DVP, and the center-right Bavarian People's Party, Hindenburg encouraged the DVP to dissolve the coalition, and thereafter appointed a series of increasingly right-wing chancellors. First the moderate and SPD-supported but economically austerityist Heinrich Brüning, the controversial former Center Party monarchist Franz von Papen, and in 1932 the penultimate Chancellor of the Republic, General Kurt von Schleicher. After he failed to form a coalition government with the by then, thanks to years of economic collapse and governmental gridlock, among other reasons, dominant Nazi Party, Hindenburg invited Adolf Hitler to serve as Chancellor. Now, the attempts of Hindenburg and other German traditional right wingers to tame the Nazi Party failed, and in a year he would die, and his conservative ilk would be purged or fall in line, and from there the rest is history. After losing World War I, the Allied occupation zones of Germany, as in the Western Allies, so the US, UK, France, and yeah, which is the US, UK, and France. In 1948, when West Germany's modern Basic Law, which was an intended to be temporary constitution for West Germany, under the watchful eye of the Western Allies, they took the lessons of the Weimar Republic to heart. Kind of. Germany has a law specifically prohibiting deficit spending of more than 0.35% of the GDP, despite austerity politics and pursuing deflation over any unemployment having ended the Weimar Republic. But the authoritarianism of the presidency, being nicknamed a quote-unquote ersatz Kaiser at the time, and its directly elected nature were eliminated. But actually the reason why it fell was there were too many parties in parliament. Look at this chart. And that's why they have the 5% rule. Uh, Anyway, that was a very long aside, but Germany has historically, rather than the UK's first past the post constituency system, um, mixed member proportional voting instead, which is more representative but debatably encourages instability. Did I really need to talk for that long? It's probably a hint into France's historical problems, different ones from Germany's, that they're on Republic number 5, with some currently agitating for number 6. Of the first four, the First Republic of France, one of the first democratic governments to be established in Europe after the Middle Ages, also tangent number a billion of this video. Isn't it weird they had republics in Europe in like antiquity and then gave up on the idea for 1,000 years? You could probably talk about that for a really long time. Which issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, beheaded the king, and defeated every reactionary monarchy in Europe. Then the general who secured those victories, Napoleon Bonaparte, ended the republic. Now, the Second Republic was established in 1848 after Napoleonic France was defeated in war. The monarchy was restored, then overthrown by Louis Philippe, the liberal citizen king, who was inaugurated by the 1830 July Revolution. But eventually, the French people tired of his conservatism and concessions to capitalists. So in 1848, Second Republic. The Second Republic lasted for a grand total of 4 years before President Louis Napoleon, nephew of the first Napoleon, was term limited, and after failing to amend the Constitution to get more terms, launched a coup on the same day as his uncle did. As Karl Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire, all great historical personages appear twice, first as tragedy, then as farce. Then the Third Republic was established in 1870, after Napoleon III was defeated in battle and captured by the Prussian army. Its first act was to put down the Paris Commune, which was an elected revolutionary government of social democrats, socialists, anarchists, and communists. Are we starting to see a theme in European history of this period? It fell in 1940 after the German occupation of France, and many French politicians, even those ostensibly on the left, collaborated with the Germans. World War One hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, I that's not how you say it, was permitted by the Germans to lord over the legal continuation of the Third Republic from the city of Vichy, being quite logically christened Vichy France. But General Charles de Gaulle led a group of those who refused to collaborate, the Free French, to exile in the UK. Now, some in the Allies during World War II, like U.S. President Roosevelt, wanted to recognize Vichy France during World War II, but ultimately de Gaulle triumphantly returned to Paris in 1944, beginning a provisional government, with France being treated as a victorious Allied nation rather than a defeated power. Now, the newly established Fifth Republic lasted from 1936 to 58. De Gaulle, who was accused by some as something of a successor to Napoleon's ideas, favored a strong executive presidency, but the parties that favored a more parliamentary republic won out. France's legislature was elected on a proportional system, which was somewhat unstable, with the republic going through 21 prime ministers in its 12-year existence. In 1958, France's colony of Algeria was in a state of civil war. The government wanted to seek a peaceful solution to the war, and in response, sections of the army, sympathetic to the French settlers in Algeria, who wanted to remain as a colony, planned a coup, with paratroopers moving from Algiers to Corsica, just off the French mainland. With a civil war at home looming, Parliament voted to suspend the Constitution and invite General de Gaulle to serve as head of state. And he would serve for president for more than 10 years, shaping France's unique semi presidential system. While Germany and the UK are more or less purely parliamentary systems, and the US of A is a notably presidential one, France has something of a balance between the two, which has also led to instability. Today's Fifth Republic of France, the one established by de Gaulle, has now thrice been in the unique system of what's called cohabitation, where the prime minister and president are of different parties, which often produces gridlock. France's most recent parliamentary election produced a parliament basically split into thirds, between the pro-current centrist liberal prime minister Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble pour la République, the far-right National Rally, and the left-wing New Popular Front. And in the 2 years since the 2024 election, Macron has appointed three PMs, each one attempting to gain a majority of the center and some portion of the left and the right, with limited degrees of success. So the US is far from the only Western democracy with an imperfect political system. I mean, obviously, none of them are perfect. But you could say the US has kind of the worst of several worlds. Congress is deliberately more undemocratic than almost anywhere else. Usually, the House roughly approximates the national popular vote, thanks to our unusually strong two party system, which leads to a weird de facto two-round system, which, as I mentioned, France's presidency is elected in that fashion, which is kind of like what primaries do. Germany and France are both countries with more representative legislatures, although they have produced gridlock, and in Germany's case helped to lead to the rise of the Nazis, which was bad. And the US presidency is uniquely strong compared to all of these countries, and has only recently been strengthened by Congress and the courts' gridlock and unpopularity. War Powers Resolution 2026, anyone? And it should be discussed, in my opinion, as a liberal priority to reform the most undemocratic parts of the Constitution, and to even think bigger and consider a more proportional Congress, eliminating the Senate or making it elected betterly, and possibly reducing the powers of the presidency. But that's never going to happen.